Gators Breakdown episode 48 is ready to go with our spring football preview. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And I'm joined by my co-host for this episode, Bill Sykes. Bill, how are we doing tonight?
We're doing great, man. It's good to be back as always.
Oh, yeah. You can find Bill on Twitter at RealBSykes. And joining us for this episode of Gators Breakdown is Thomas Goldkamp. You know Thomas from the Gators beat reporter for 24/7 Sports Florida site, GatorBait, where Bill and I are both members. So, Thomas, I can't thank you enough for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
All right, then. Difficult dive into spring football here, and plenty to talk about. We know quarterback is first and foremost on everybody's minds. But before we jump in with Thomas, I want to let you know you can find all your Gators Breakdown episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, right here live on YouTube. Just search those sites or get the links by following us on Twitter at Gators Breakdown, and on Facebook, just search Gators Breakdown. If you like the show, share it, leave a review, rate on iTunes. All that helps us out here on Gators Breakdown. So, Thomas, we're just going to dive right into it. I know plenty to talk about, like I mentioned, and people want to get your side of things from knowing your knowledge, being close to the Gators program.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you guys for having me on. Feel free to shoot whatever you got at me, and we'll kick it around. Spring ball just a week away.
That's right. So let's break down some Gators football. Thomas, be the first time we get to see the new coaches in action when they step on the field. What do you expect to see from Sider, Bell, and Davis that maybe we haven't seen from the previous staff?
Well, I think energy is the first thing. You know, we talked to them last week, got a chance to get to know them a little bit, interview them in their first press conference at Florida. And that was really the number one thing that stood out to me. You know, all of those guys, very, very personable coaches. I think that, you kind of feel the exuberance of most of those guys being at a place like Florida. But like I always tell people, assistant coaches are kind of hard to evaluate. To me, you have to see them really operate for 2 to 3 years, not just in practices, but how they interact with recruits on campus. And, as a reporter, that's something that we're able to be on the ground and see. And a lot of times people will ask us our opinions on, this coach or that coach. It's really hard to tell until you're around them for a while. But I think the number one thing we'll see a real spike in energy, particularly I think offensive line coach Brad Davis. That really stood out. He's a very laser-focused guy, has a real idea of what he wants to accomplish. And I think that that's going to be a very positive thing for that unit going forward.
Yeah, couldn't agree more there. Bill, you want to jump in right there?
Yeah, I watched the press conference, and the now, I guess it's quickly becoming infamous press conference with Brad Davis, and it was just really striking to me how on one hand you had this guy that, like you said, was laser focused, he was intense, but the guy was very organized. He was dropping little verbiage here and there that was like reminiscent of professional leadership concepts you hear about. This is a man who has taken his education at the University of Oklahoma seriously, and he's incorporated what he's learned about organizational leadership, transformational leadership, servanthood in leadership, things that I think indicate that the guy, like Thomas said, has a focus and a plan. And it's not just somebody that kind of came up through an old school coaching mentality. It's somebody that's saying, you know what, I want to dig into the meat and potatoes and the science behind this and figure out how to motivate these young men and make them better. And I just thought that was really impressive.
Agree there. We dove into the coaches from our thoughts earlier episodes there, so you can check those out if you want to know more about these coaches. But let's go ahead and get on to the players on the field, and we know the big storyline. Thomas, you've been cranking out your best spring position battles articles lately, and today you ended it with the most anticipated battle of them all with the quarterback. It figures to mostly be a two-man battle between Felipe Franks and Kyle Trask, with Kadarius Toney maybe sprinkled in there. What do we need to see from these quarterbacks this spring for one of them to be the guy? Because there are still many people out there that think Jim McElwain could still go with Luke Del Rio when they kick off versus Michigan.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I think that the reason Florida went with Del Rio last year, obviously they brought in 2 freshman quarterbacks in Franks and Trask that were very raw and probably needed some time. But the biggest thing about Luke Del Rio was that he was a guy that was not going to theoretically make a lot of mistakes. And we saw that early in the year. He was very effective in the first couple games, didn't turn it over, made the safe throws, didn't necessarily stretch the defense a whole lot or, hit those pinpoint windows that, Florida fans would love to see. But he was safe enough with the football that the coaches felt they could trust him. And I think that is the number one thing that Florida has to get from these guys in this spring, because we saw them last spring. Felipe Franks was a little bit of a disaster in the spring game. And frankly, it was kind of like that throughout spring ball. So we need those guys to be able to get to the point where if you're Florida's coaches, you can trust them to go out and operate game in and game out. They're going to make mistakes, absolutely. But they need to get to the point where they can cut down on those enough to where you can really have a functional offense where the confidence from the rest of those guys isn't shot before it really starts.
Yeah, Thomas, it's funny you mentioned that being safe for the football. We all talked, I guess we've talked the whole time about how Florida needed a game manager with its defense. And I think that was the plan for McElwain. He knew he had Mark Thompson coming in. He knew he had Scarlett. I think he wanted to pound the football, take a few shots to the air, and win with defense. And I think it was a sound plan, just didn't quite work out to the extent we wanted it to. But, kind of moving forward with our eye on that concept about protecting the football, Florida was right in the middle nationally when it came to turnover ratio at about 49th in the country last year, because even though they took away 24 turnovers, they gave away 22, with 15 of those being interceptions. And that's something going forward, even if we don't see, high-flying acrobatics to the passing game, they've got to clean that up or they're not going to get where they want to be.
No doubt. And I really think this offense is kind of structured to do that. I think that Jim McElwain, for all the lack of production that Florida has had, the offense is really geared to take advantage of those situations. And that's what McElwain is always preaching, take what the defense gives you and eventually they'll give you the game. And we've seen that happen at times. And I think that the biggest thing for Florida is that needs to start happening against better teams, because they've been able to do it for the most part. That's why you see Florida not lose those cupcake games. They haven't really had too many issues with those under McElwain, but it needs to get to a point where those guys are building confidence to the point where, you go from those blowouts and some of the, the lesser teams, and then suddenly those guys feel like they can hit those throws against better athletes, against better defenses, against better coverages. And that's when you see Florida really start to take the next step from not just being a team that can win the SEC East, but a team that can really push the Alabamas and the Florida States.
We were just talking about this before we got on the air because I was working on some statistical analysis. And in 2 of Florida's 4 losses, they were crippled by turnovers. Arkansas, they spotted them 14 points with pick sixes in like the first 5 seconds, and then you have Alabama where they got about 14 points, I believe it was, or if not more, off of turnovers. It's got to change or you're not going to get over the hump.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I think that, not to segue too far here, but special teams is a big part of that. You mentioned the Alabama game. I'd like to see Florida get back to the real Florida special teams of old. But yeah, when you're turning the ball over on offense, you're really crippling yourself. And Florida's not going to have quite the same defense to rely on this year. So the offense really has to do its part to take that next step, or this team, may get mired in mediocrity here.
Thomas, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's kind of I was thinking about that. Do you think we see this offense have to open up more because they know they can't rely on this defense, or is it still going to be the kind of safe offense, run first, and then try and hit a deep ball every now and then, or can the running game actually take over a game? Is it more about the offensive line coming around and helping the run game, or do you still, or can this offense open up if Felipe Franks or Kyle Trask is that playmaker?
Well, so that's kind of a nuanced question. I think that kind of big picture, if you're looking at it as a coach, you don't ever go into, I don't think, a season or anything thinking, yeah, we need to open it up. You always kind of play game by game and have your plan. And I think that we've seen Florida be very aggressive, especially early in games. They take the shots. Now, when they do that offensive script for the first, drive or 2 of games, and they're not connecting on those deep balls, well, then that's when you start to see them dial it back a little bit and play a little bit more conservative and rely on that defense. So I don't think like going into the year, you have this, situation as coaches where suddenly you throw out everything and you're, throwing the kitchen sink at everybody right from the start. It's definitely a play it by feel thing. But I do think that Florida could end up in a situation where, it's realistic to expect the defense to take a little bit of a step back. And so at a certain point, you're going to run into a situation where you're playing from behind a little bit and you do have to open it up. And Florida needs to be ready for that. The good news is I think that they've got the playmakers on offense to do that. I think they've got an offensive line that should be much better next year with, an extra year of seasoning, 4 out of the 5 starters back. The real question is, can these quarterbacks get to the point where they are competent enough to really take that step forward and allow Jim McElwain's offense to do what it's supposed to do on a consistent basis?
Yeah, and to build on that, you talk about building confidence and having a plan to win. We all know that every year there's a few times during the season where you get to the end of a close game and the announcers start talking about, well, what do you do here? You're in an iffy down and distance situation, an iffy spot on the field. And when you have a team like Florida's had the last few years, inevitably they say, well, hey, this is a salty defense. I say you punt and let your defense win the game. Well, do you do that now? And really, I don't know. Like you said, they're going to take a step back, and they need to have that guy on offense at quarterback. Even if he's not great, they've got pretty good skill position players coming back. They've got to develop that identity where late in those games, a few times this year, they can affect the outcome by saying, no, I think they're going to go for it here, guys. They want to rely on their quarterback. They want to rely on their offense. And the offense, for the first time in a decade, is going to have to go out and win a couple ball games.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the perfect word, mentality, and that's something that we've heard Jim McElwain really, really harp on, going back to the Outback Bowl even after that game where they won very convincingly. He said, quite frankly, still wasn't up to snuff. We didn't take it to him. We didn't pound him in the trenches, and, we should. And I think that, Florida has been aggressive, and I think that they've probably been even maybe more aggressive than we'll see them be next year in terms of the offense because they've had the defense to rely on. Now, you don't have that equation, so it's hard to say, or did they get more aggressive or do they, maybe even get more conservative with the offense and, punt and play to the defense. But I think the main thing is the mentality part of it that you mentioned. They've got to get tougher. McElwain's made that abundantly clear. I think that some of the hires that, they've brought in can really help towards that. But really, for an offense to really get better and get to the next stage, they have to get to the point where they're doing it and they're seeing themselves do it on tape. And we've seen Florida get there for a little bit. I think early in the season, we really, really saw that. The first 3 games, they come out, they play pretty well, they execute well, and then you see them go and put up 21 straight points at Tennessee. Now, it all kind of fell apart from there. And so then that's when you see the confidence sag again and, the results start to disappear. Florida's got to get to that point. There's no more excuses. They've got a veteran offensive line at this point. They've got playmakers at receiver, at running back. They've got it everywhere at quarterback. They really just have to get to the point where they believe that they can do it, and they do it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bill.
I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Dave. I just got a couple of hypotheticals for Thomas at the quarterback position here. Let's say this spring, I know we're not going to hear everything we want to hear. I know it's going to be secretive. I know we can't trust the spring game results. But what if Kyle Trask emerges privately behind closed doors as the guy? And just for our listeners that may not understand this, Kyle Trask was an obscure take for Florida a year ago. He was a guy who, allegedly because of the system they ran, didn't start in high school. But he looked good on tape. He looked good for the coaches when he performed for them. They thought they got a steal with a guy. We've heard good things. We've even heard rumors at times that he might be the guy. And, his coach says maybe he ends up on a 30 for 30 special one day. This is going to be a big story. So let's say this guy wins the job privately, and in fall camp he holds off Jake Allen. He is the guy. Do you trot a guy out in Arlington, Texas against Michigan who has never started a football game, a guy whose best season yardage-wise was 2014, his high school junior year, when he went 48 of 68 for 786 yards? Do you think that's a possibility?
I absolutely think it's a possibility. Now, I'll add the caveat that if Florida brings in another player at some point, then maybe that obviously changes things. But at this point, a redshirt freshman's going to have to play. I mean, barring Florida rolling Luke Del Rio out there again, one of those two guys is playing. And if Trask is that guy, then he's going to play. And I'll be honest with you, from what we've seen of open practices, which isn't a ton, in the spring we see 3 to 4 open periods. We get to see them throw some pass skeleton, some fastball, which is 11 on 11 work, and then routes on air. I have always been a little bit higher on Kyle Trask than Felipe Franks. Now, I will say that, from what we haven't seen, it does sound like Felipe Franks has taken a jump. It sounds like he's a little bit more confident as a quarterback. Obviously, there was a reason he won the backup job, when Luke Del Rio was out last year. But for me personally, I think Kyle Trask is a little bit more accurate. I like the way that he throws the ball and can hit some of the routes that Franks maybe can't a little bit better. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. And frankly, if they have to start one of the two, it's going to happen. I mean, this is a scenario that's going to happen unless Florida does something different and brings in a transfer that we don't know about yet.
Well, man, I got to say, for me personally, I would rather see us go down swinging for the fence with a Kyle Trask than come back out with Luke Del Rio when there's just been some frustration there. And that's no offense to Luke Del Rio. Maybe he ends up a 3,000-yard passer next year. But I think that there's almost more risk for Jim McElwain if you trot Del Rio out there and he has a 175-yard game and you lose 16-13 against Michigan. You're starting your season off in a rocky place with the fans, in a critical year. So I kind of with you. I'd rather see it.
No question. And I mean, look, we can make the argument all day that Luke Del Rio was hurt after, the third game. And, was he favoring the knee after that when he came back? Was the shoulder, an issue even for him in the Arkansas game? At the end of the day, we told you guys who Luke Del Rio was in the spring before he was ever hurt. He was a guy that was going to do well, make the safe decisions against the cupcake type teams and probably put up big numbers. But the question we had for Luke Del Rio was he going to have the arm strength and the ability to fit it in there in the tight windows against the elite teams? And, we didn't actually get a chance to see a healthy Luke Del Rio even attempt to do that. But my answer is still no on that. And so I think at that point, if you're Jim McElwain, you've got to think about the future of your program. If you've had 2 years where you're in the bottom 20 of the country in offense, you're an offensive guru. At some point, you're going to put yourself up against a mountain that's impossible to overcome if you don't start to show that improvement. And I think that by playing a younger guy that has a lot more arm talent than a Luke Del Rio, you give yourself the chance to really build and craft a narrative, not just on the field, but in recruiting, to where, you can get not only your own players buying into that confidence and the belief that they can really, really improve and be better, but then you have something to sell to recruits, which frankly, at the end of the day, Florida needs to do just a little bit better, even given the good finish on National Signing Day this year.
Yeah, I think Bill and I have talked. We can't stress enough how we think a good performance on the field can help recruiting in and of itself. I think the recruits are getting tired of seeing this dink and dunk offense and subpar quarterback play. If you just get that one quarterback that can come in and show that it can be done, a la Real Greer for end of Tennessee game and the Ole Miss game, recruits got excited around that time. You can show that again. Then I really think that's just a spark that recruits need to see.
No doubt, and I don't think this program's all that far away. Sorry, Bill. I think they're close. I think they're close. I think you said it. I mean, they were right. After that Ole Miss game, it felt like the floodgates were about to open in recruiting. And granted, at the time, we didn't really know Jim McElwain as well. We didn't really know his staff and some of the limitations they had. But this is a program that needs that right now. And I think that starting one of these young guys gives you that potential. And I don't know that they'll be the answer, but I think at this point, you're pretty much at at a point in time where you've got to try it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are saying this is going to be his year. They're going to kick the door down on Alabama, and I understand why Jim McElwain said that. But we've talked the last few weeks about how listen, if we're going to be patient with Jim McElwain to this point with the offense, let the defense have another year to rebuild. Let one of these redshirt freshmen come in and have a year to develop. Expect 2018 to be the championship year. And based on that, I would rather see a 2007 type year. And I know that might be extreme because you're talking about a Heisman Trophy winner. But even if you just had a quarterback that came in and had moments where he lit it up, when he had 3 or 4 300-yard games and really just hung some points on people, but you still lose 3 or 4 games. Well, maybe not 3 or 4, but if you still you don't win the SEC, but you have a really potent offense and you see that identity start to emerge, I think that's going to do more for the program on the recruiting trail than it would if you have a 2-loss season with Luke Del Rio. So I think there might be more benefit to style points at this point and the long-term health of the program.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And you mentioned 2007. I think that's a good comparison in some ways and not in other ways. I actually think as much as this defense loses, it's nowhere close to what they lost in 2007. And so you don't necessarily need an offense that has a Heisman Trophy winner at quarterback or, puts up the kind of numbers that offense did. But if you can get to the point where you're kind of more in the middle ground between offense and defense, where it's not, a Florida team that wins solely on defense, which is really what we've seen for the last several years. And you have some games where the defense carries you, or some games where the offense is able to make up for a bad defensive game, to where at least, even if you're not winning, that you're competitive in the whole game. And I think that's the biggest problem. Florida's been able to beat the teams under McElwain that it's supposed to, but it hasn't been competitive in some of the games where it's maybe not the favorite. That has to change. I think if that changes, the narrative changes. And for that to change, the offense has to get to the point where it can carry the defense through at least some of these bad games. Maybe not all of them. Maybe they lose a couple. But they get to the point where at least the fans feel like they have a chance in every game.
Right. Let's talk about, why we think this offense maybe can take the next steps, and that's the playmakers around the quarterback. I think we have to remember this is the first spring Antonio Callaway will be able to take part in. So, while it not necessarily may help him out, you got to think it helps Frank Centraski out to have the best receiver on the team to build a rapport with him this spring.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, he's a fantastic player. I would expect big things from him. I think the biggest thing for Antonio Callaway at this point is finding somebody else that can challenge defensive backs, right? I mean,
yeah,
the guy's been phenomenal, but he even said it last year. He's getting looks that he's never seen where safeties are rolling to him every time. He's getting double covered. I mean, to me, for Florida to take the next step, they need more than just one Antonio Callaway. They need 2, 3, maybe 4 guys like him.
Yeah, and I think realistically, I think you'd probably agree with this, that I think that the potential is there for that right now. With Cleveland at one side and with Callaway on the other, I think that's going to be a formidable twosome. And if Dre Massey ends up being what they think and what he was purported to be, they may have that trio of receivers to come in and do some damage, maybe. Now, we've got to see it because we've been hearing for a while this may happen, that may happen, and it just hasn't yet.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think James Robinson could potentially be another guy like that. I mean, I think that Florida, we've said it a couple times already here. I think that they've got the pieces around the quarterback to really make it happen. I don't know that any of their running backs right now are necessarily game breakers. I like the 2 guys that they brought in, but if you get just 1 or 2 more, suddenly it opens up things for everybody else. I mean, Callaway's an elite playmaker, but he could be even better if he just wasn't double covered all the time. And I think you're absolutely right. I think Tyree Cleveland is a guy who can do that. And especially now that you have a quarterback that can really open the field, downfield for a guy like that, I think it could really make a difference.
Yeah, I talk about the struggles in the run game. Oh, my bad, Bill. Talk about the struggles in the run game and how the offensive line could probably help the run game some. But Thomas, that's where I want to extend off of what you just said. I really think the run game can be benefited whether these teams can't stack the box, play after play just because there's no threat of a passing game. Maybe these running backs, I think the one thing they can work on to get better is, and I know you've mentioned it, pass blocking has been absolutely terrible from these guys, and that's something they could take the next step in. But as far as the running game itself goes, is it more just about the offensive line coming around, or is there something these guys can do?
I think it is, and I almost brought this up earlier when we were talking about Brad Davis. One of the major things that I think about Mike Summers at this point, after having watched him for 3 years, and again, I feel like you really need a couple years to see how they work, is Mike Summers was very much a technician, at the offensive line position. And what I mean by that is he was very focused on landmarks with the feet, getting the hand placement right, and all that kind of thing. And so I think what that did for Florida is it made them a much better pass blocking team. Now, 2015, they had a very young unit. They gave up the most sacks in the country. But if you look at what he did in 2014, coming off a really awful 2013, and then what he did, after they gave up the most sacks in 2015, they were pretty good pass blocking this year. Mm-hmm. So I think what his units have typically been able to do is focus really on being in the right place in terms of pass blocking from an offensive line standpoint. I think that's one thing that he did really well. On the flip side of that, I think that they were thinking so much about that they never really translated it to the running game. And what I mean by that is they were so focused on where they needed to be or doing the right technique that they never really just punched people in the mouth. And I think that could be a major difference with Brad Davis, because I don't know enough about him as a technician yet. He may be a great technician too. But the one thing from talking to him, it seems like he's going to be a guy that really is able to fire those guys up and just get them pounding off the line of scrimmage. And that's what I think the Florida run game has been missing. It's not that they're not in the right places. A lot of times they pull well, they get in front of the right guys, but there's no follow through. There's no drive through those blocks. And once you start toppling those guys and getting to the second level, that's when the running backs don't have to beat as many people, and they can really start to break some of those explosive runs that Florida's been missing.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, I want to see that. It seems like it's been since 2010 that we've been suffering from this epidemic of going out against cupcake opponents and having a third and one at some point in the game and not be able to get it against an inferior opponent and just getting no push off the line, just being stonewalled. And, I don't know. It's transcended Mike Summers. It's gone beyond him. It was, for a few offensive line coaches now. And really, it seems like this offensive line quarterback thing has been a 1-2 punch that's just really devastated the offense for a long time. And so that's why I am cautiously optimistic and wanting to be a little excited because now that you've got a veteran offensive line that's not going to start a freshman unless Kadeem Telford comes in, otherworldly. You finally got a little bit of a depth there. You finally got some experience there. You've got a couple of promising redshirt freshmen at quarterbacks, and you would like to think that maybe for once we can get pushed off the line, we can have clean pockets, and we can have a guy that can read a defense and deliver the football. I mean, is that too much to ask?
No, I mean, I don't think so. And again, maybe this is totally off the wall. This is not, obviously fact or anything, but I really do think that Mike Summers' insistence on the technical aspects of the game just had those guys thinking a little too much. And that's totally a personal opinion. That's, that's not from people I've talked to, but that just observing, it seemed like they were just thinking too much. And I think that with an offensive line coach that maybe stresses a little bit more just finishing and energy and just that general vibe up front of dominating, I think that they could take a massive step forward.
Hey, who do you think starts at left tackle? Like, who do you think comes out of spring anyway?
Well, I think Martez Ivy's the obvious candidate there. Potentially maybe they move Jawan Taylor over. I think he's a guy that could play that role too. But I think you look at a guy like Martez Ivy and, hearing some of the comments that Brad Davis made about him last week as far as leadership, I think he's an obvious fit there, and I'd be very surprised if anybody else ended up at that spot.
You feel like his shoulders are probably good to go, or have you heard?
Yeah, I mean, he seemed to do all right last year. He had a much better year, obviously, than his freshman year. He's obviously going to have some work to do after basically playing inside for most of his first 2 years. But I think he's the guy, and I think we saw enough strides from him last year as a player. After a pretty rough freshman year. I mean, he didn't look anything like a 5-star player as a freshman. I think that he kind of made us reassess his ceiling back to where it probably was as a recruit. I think he's got a lot of upside.
Yep. Move the tight ends before we finish up on offense, or Bill, you can jump back in. But I think kind of like running back, I think we know what we have in those guys. Goolsby needs to work on pass blocking. Lewis's catching skills that really showed up late in the season. Is Kamor Gamble a guy that can come in as an early enrollee and push these guys? Because as a recruit, I really like what I saw from his hands and willingness to actually block, even as a high schooler.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know exactly where he stacks up with DeAndre Goolsby and Ciante Lewis as far as an athletic pass catching threat. I think he's probably not quite as good of an athlete as Lewis is. And Goolsby's kind of a natural catching the ball, but that's certainly something he can do. The question for me, I think, is how big can he get, how quickly, being on campus, since January, and then how does he do as a blocker? Because that's something that high school players always struggle to adjust. A guy like Gamble has really never had to sit there and block SEC defensive ends, and that's something you're going to have to do at the SEC level.
Yeah, that's the one position on offense where even though we do have a lot of natural receiving ability from Lewis and from Goolsby, you don't have that guy that you say, that's the guy that needs to be on the field every down for the Florida Gators on offense. I mean, the receivers are emerging. We don't necessarily know what the combination up front on the offensive line is going to be, but you've got plenty of them there to choose from. You've got a couple of quarterbacks. You've got a good run back, but I don't see an every down tight end. And, the roster, I think, has Kamor Gamble as 6'4", 230. If he does show up to camp with a solid 235, 240, this might be a guy that could sneak in there and start to take away snaps.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. And I think it kind of what we talked about with the running backs, having kind of a pass blocking deficiency. I think the tight ends are in a similar mold where Florida's offense's creativity has really been limited by guys that can only do one of the two things. When DeAndre Goolsby is in, you can send an end off the end, and you got a pretty good chance of getting to the quarterback. Vice versa, if Ciante Lewis is in, great player, runs good routes, can get open, but he's dropped a lot of third down passes, and so it makes you a little bit predictable. If Florida has a guy that can come in and do both, I don't think there's any question that he has a chance to start. Florida's tight ends, to me, were one of the most disappointing positions on the roster last year. Really thought DeAndre Goolsby was going to be a breakout star, and it just never happened.
Yeah, and that's something that needs to happen for these young quarterbacks. They need to have that safety valve player to bail them out because they're going to be in tough situations.
Yeah, and I mean, Jake McGee, in 2015 was, I think, probably underrated by a lot of us. I think we all saw what DeAndre Goolsby and Lewis were able to do, at various points in that season and figured, look, it maybe even be better. These guys are more athletic than McGee was, but, I don't think we realized, some of the blocking impact. And McGee was far from a great blocker, But just being able to have him on the field in those situations where it wasn't a liability was really a big deal for that offense. And Florida took a step back there last year.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, we talk about finding offensive identity. A lot of the guys from the NFL always talk about if you're going to run the ball in the league. Now, this is kind of the pre-spread offense influence of the last few years there. But traditionally, they always talked about winning the numbers game up front. You've either got to have a fullback to help you out, which that's not in vogue anymore like it used to be, or you've got to have a tight end that can help you move. And like you said, you've got to have a guy in there that's not predictable. If it's a 220-pound guy that can't block, well, they're not going to worry about you, and they're going to win the numbers game when you run the ball.
Right, absolutely. And it shouldn't be something that's that hard, to figure out. I think part of that goes back to recruiting. Florida has tended to recruit a little bit of the smaller body, and Ethan Gamble's kind of another one where he's coming in at about 220. They haven't really recruited, say, a true inline tight end. So I think that Florida wants them to be a mismatch in the passing game. I think that much is clear at this point. Now they've got to find a guy that can at least be serviceable enough as a blocker to really make that happen.
All right, Bill, anything else on the offensive side of the ball before we move on?
No, we'll move on for time's sake.
All right. Thomas, of defensive end, I think we know maybe CeCe Jefferson, weak side, maybe I guess has that locked up. And I guess what I'm trying to see here is there's numbers, but I guess kind of like a puzzle. Where do these guys fit? Can Jabari Zuniga or Jordan Sherritt be the player that's needed along on the strong side at defensive end?
Well, I think Zuniga obviously slots in there. That's kind of where he played last year. I think that he'll continue to add size and strength and be, a pretty good fit there. His obvious issue was kind of setting the edge against the run, which when you lose Brian Cox, granted they played without him a lot last year, but that's what he was really good at. So I think that's what you need to find on the strong side. And so I think for that reason, I would probably peg Jordan Sherritt to that side and leave CeCe to the weak side. But I do like the bodies Florida has there. I'd like to see in recruiting them start to go after a little bit bigger guys to get more of a balance between the big, and those shiftier, faster guys that can get around the edge.
Yeah, Thomas, this was one of the main things I kind of wanted to talk to you about and get your opinion on. You mentioned Brian Cox on the Florida Gators website. His last year there, he played 6'3", 268 pounds. Okay, and then you had CeCe Jefferson, 6'1", 266, and you had a few others. But now that he's gone, Jordan Sherritt's at 254 pounds, and then Jefferson's at 266. But listen to these weights for the rest of your defensive end. Antonius Clayton, 6'3", 220. You've got Kavanis Davis, 6'4", 241. Jabari Zuniga, 6'3", 245. Justice Reed, 6'3", 241. And Jordan Smith, 6'5", 240. You do not have a lot of weight there to ask these guys to set the edge. And obviously, we've got a spring to go through. We've got a summer. They're going to do a lot of time at the training table. But what do you think about this as it projects to their ability to set the edge this year?
Well, I think it's a concern, and I think that it becomes even more of a concern when you realize what they're losing inside, because those inside guys tended to, they tended to take up a lot of blockers and really make it easier for those ends. And, I think it's something that I just mentioned that, I'd like to see Florida recruit a little bit more size at that position going forward. So you got less guys that are projects where you really have to put weight on them before they can really contribute. I think it's a legitimate concern for Florida. You got new linebackers, you got new defensive tackles. Stopping the run is not going to be a given for Florida next year. And I think that this is a massive offseason for those ends in terms of being able to bulk up some so that you can really kind of count on at least a few of them to really be in there on run situations where you can count on them.
Yeah, you mentioned defensive tackle. That's where I'll go next. It looks like Taven Bryan, Kerry Clark. We'll get the first look, but we saw the issues. And Thomas, I think you tweeted something a couple weeks ago or whatever. We saw the issues when Caleb Brantley wasn't on the field. What can the Gators find here to make up for losing Brantley? Because I'm not sure they can replicate anything close to what he brought to the field with the guys they currently have on the roster.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's be honest. You're not going to replace a Caleb Brantley, who's likely a first or second round NFL draft pick. It's the same situation with Jonathan Bullard. You can get close, but your line's going to shift. And so basically, to me, what has to happen is guys have to step up at other spots. And you look at guys like CeCe Jefferson, got to play better. Kavanis Davis really has to become more of a factor. Jabari Zuniga, same thing. But in terms of the tackles, I like that they have some experience there. Kerry Clark and Taven Bryan have both played a ton of snaps. So you're going to get at least okay play from them. You're going to have guys that can do that. The question is, where does the depth emerge there? I really, really am high on Ja'Kai Polite as a player. I think he could maybe potentially even push for a starting spot if he can get a little bit bigger, because I think he's got some of that kind of burst and disruptiveness that Caleb Brantley had. Beyond that, that's really the question mark to me. I don't know what any of these other guys bring to the table, and frankly, it's a little bit concerning.
Yeah, and really, Polite is another one that's a little bit undersized. He's kind of a tweener. He's 6'2", so he's not really prototypical height for an end, but he's 271 pounds on the roster, so not prototypical weight for a tackle. And I'm kind of with you. I think that they're going to probably try to pack another 15 pounds on him over the summer, maybe play in that 3 technique role, maybe try to be the disruptor. And I think he'll be pretty good at it. I think if there's one guy that I'm looking at that I think may be surprising, and it might be Kyrie Campbell. I think he's in a very similar role as to what David Reese was last year, where you have up front your starters, like the linebackers last year, 2 very good players. And while our 2 this year at defensive tackle might not be good, just like that position at linebacker last year, there's not a lot of depth behind. He's a guy that is an injury away, or maybe not even that. Maybe he's just going to be thrust right into the 2 deep right away, and I think he's somebody that could surprise. He's a high motor guy. He's a big body guy. We'll see.
Yeah, I like that he's on campus early. I have to be honest with you, I'm not real high on his film. I think that he's a guy that tends to pop out of his stance right away, which is a major, major issue when you get to the SEC. Now, maybe that can be coached out of him. But frankly, I'm a little bit higher on the other 2 guys coming in, Slayton and Conliffe, coming in the summer. But, Florida has a little bit of time. They've got 3 guys that they probably feel they can count on. So finding a 4th shouldn't be that tough. If Campbell's that guy and he has a great spring, that's great for Florida, because then they have a little bit more experience in knowing what they can get out of him. But personally, I'm not extremely high on him. I think the other 2 probably have a better chance to make an impact.
Yeah, Slayton certainly looks like a future wrecking ball on either side of the football for Florida, and I love Conliffe. Unfortunately, they're not going to be there for spring, and I wish they were.
Yeah, no doubt. Either one of those would help, and I think that goes back to some of the recruiting. That's why there was a lot of angst from Florida fans. When neither of those guys was on board about a week before signing day, and fans are wondering what is going on at that position. But luckily, Florida was able to close it out. I think they got 2 very good ones, but again, they don't get here till the summer.
Yeah, we had our love fest between those 2 guys when we did our recruiting shows.
I'm trying to give Kyrie some love, man. It's funny though. Well, maybe not so funny. Florida had about half of the early enrollees this year as they did last year, which I think that's somewhat natural, with last year being the bump class, for Jim McElwain. But of the 5 they had, they got 1 defensive tackle, which was a key position, but didn't get anybody in the secondary to help coming in early. I know they tried to have Sean Davis come in, but it would have been really nice to have a DB to deal with.
Yeah, luckily, I think those skill positions, the further out you go from the ball, typically the easier it is to come in and make an immediate impact. And certainly that's happened in the past at Florida with some of these guys. But yeah, cornerback is a real concern. Dave mentioned it. I had said it a couple weeks back. Defensive tackle and cornerback, biggest concerns to me on the roster. And granted, Florida has 4 guys that they can count on coming back in the secondary, but you look at some of the other ones, and really Florida was in some situations last year where they were down on depth. There were situations where Jalen Tabor was out or Duke Dawson was out here and there, and Florida opted not to go with those younger guys, the Chris Williamsons, the Joseph Putus, the MacArthur Burnett's. So to me, that's a real concern. I think that those Florida coaches weren't ready to play those guys, and if they don't get ready soon, one injury could really, really affect the outlook in the secondary going forward.
Yeah, and what's interesting, if I could present one silver lining to this, and as you know me, I'm always positive. When you take the field in spring, you've got Duke Dawson, who might get a shot at corner. You got C.J. McWilliams, who might get a shot at corner. You got Chris Williamson, MacArthur Burnett, Chauncey Gardner, and Joseph Putu. That's a lot of guys to get looks for in the spring. And yes, I would much rather have the most talented freshman coming in available. I'm not trying to spin this at all. But you're going to be able to work those guys out and know their capabilities when you come into fall camp, when you get another 5 DBs coming in. So they're going to have some bodies. Yes, they're going to be very young, but it's almost going to be a phased approach to solving this cornerback problem.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that's extremely helpful. I think, the more coaches get eyes on guys, the more they feel that they know about them. And maybe it doesn't show up until a game, what a guy really can do or can't do. But the fact that they know allows them to kind of put together a little bit more of a plan to where, look, maybe they get nothing out of any of those guys that you just mentioned in the spring. and they know, hey, we need to roll 3 of these freshmen into one of these starting spots and see which one wins it. That can be a good thing. So, like you said, the fact that they have enough bodies to really test and kind of tinker around in the spring is definitely a positive for Florida.
Before we move on from cornerback, Thomas, who do you think stays inside between Duke and Chauncey Gardner?
I don't know. I think that that both have the ability to play outside, probably a little bit more than even maybe fans think. I think that Dawson showed it a little bit in the Outback Bowl, the ability to do that. But I really love Chauncey Gardner's speed. I think that gives him a little bit more upside as an outside cornerback. And given that Dawson has been so good and showed such a nose for the ball from that inside nickelback spot, I think you'd prefer to keep Dawson there, allow him to even help communicate with some of those young linebackers, kind of a little bit in the run game. That's how I prefer to play it, but I could really see it happening either way.
All right, and we'll go to linebacker before we wrap up here. I think it's a position where Florida has a lot to sort through, but it's talented, guys to really sort through there. And David Reese looks like he has the middle locked up. But what happens on the outside? I mean, Florida has some options there.
Yeah, I think I think the two that I really look at are Kylan Johnson and Boshawn Joseph. I think that both of those guys had very similar issues last year, and maybe it doesn't show up to the casual fan, but both of them kind of jumped out of their gaps a lot, and a lot of times weren't even hurt by it because Florida was so good, elsewhere, that some of these secondary guys were able to cover it up. Marcel Harris playing great, really helped cover up some of those issues there. But when you watch it on film, both of those guys, for different reasons, I think Joseph was just a little bit over aggressive, whereas Kylan Johnson seemed to be more of a recognition issue. That's what they really have to shore up. I think that I like Joseph's upside a little bit more as a player. I think that he's a guy that can really obviously lay the wood, and those are the types that really force turnovers that you'd like to have as a defense. But I think one of those two guys ends up battling it out this spring and coming out with the lead.
Hey, why do you think they took so many linebackers in this class when we do run so much nickel these days?
That's a good question. I really don't know the answer to that. I was a bit surprised by that too, especially with the late take of Brunson. I think that some of that, a lot of times when you're talking linebackers, depending on the frames of each of those guys, and I haven't really, dug into that enough to really say one way or the other, but a lot of times some of those guys can turn into rush ends that you stand up, do this or that. Neron Ball is a guy that comes to mind in that frame where he was kind of a linebacker DN hybrid in high school. Where, like we talked about with the defensive ends, if they are trying to bulk up several of those guys, maybe they're able to shift some of those linebacker types to an edge rusher. Maybe that's why.
That really is reminiscent of old school Miami. They used to say that Miami would recruit their safeties to be linebackers and their linebackers to be defensive ends. And, look who's in charge now. Yeah,
well, and anytime you have that kind of speed on the field, it really does help. And I think you nailed it. Look who's in charge.
I guess
go ahead, man. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
It's good. I guess while we're there, Thomas, how much do you expect we see change from Randy Shannon stepping in over for Collins?
Well, I think a little bit. I think the biggest place I would be prepared to see some change. I don't know if expect is the right word, but be prepared to see some changes really in the secondary. I think that if you look at Corey Bell's track record, he's really only coached DBs for 3 years in college at Florida Atlantic. And Florida's scheme, as it's been run, kind of from Will Muschamp transitioning changed a little bit when Jeff Collins took over. But it's really, really important that those cornerbacks, that those safeties are able to read patterns and be able to adjust their coverage accordingly. And I think that with such a young DB group and now having a coach that maybe, I don't know Bell enough. It goes back to not wanting to evaluate assistants too early, but just given the track record, may not be quite as much of a technician with those DBs. I think that you may see things simplified in the secondary a little bit and maybe even get more aggressive up front to try to simplify those, some of the things for the guys in the back end.
Yeah, the good news is that, and we mentioned this on the show a couple of weeks ago, if let's say that Chauncey does slide out to corner, let's say you keep Duke at the nickel, and let's say Nick Washington is at one safety and Marcel Harris is on the other. And then if Putu was to win the job, Chauncey Gardner's your only underclassman and probably your best DB, and the rest of the guys would be seniors. And I know it may not work out that way, but in a transition year, in a year when you really have some issues of where you need to protect certain positions on the field, that could be really great for Florida this year. The problem comes in if you do have a Chris Henderson on the opposite side of a Chauncey, or if you have Henderson and Marco Wilson out there, and that's a possibility. If you get real young, real fast in that secondary, they're going to have to scheme to protect those guys. And do they have the capability of the edge rush to make that happen? Do they have a guy that can collapse the pocket on the interior to make that happen? That's where this thing gets dicey real fast.
Right, and I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think that it's reasonable to expect this defense to take a step back. Now, having said that, I was very encouraged by a lot of the performances from some of the young guys last year, the Voshon Josephs, the David Reeses, the Chauncey Gardners. I mean, I think that they probably did even more than I expected, and so that makes me optimistic that Florida probably won't have a drastic drop-off. That said, like you mentioned, you got to find where your strengths are, and I think spring ball is a lot about that. You got to find out which positions you really feel comfortable on making a difference against the elite teams, because those are the games that you really need to be able to hone in on what you need to do and how you're going to game plan. And I think that Florida has a chance to do that. I think that they especially the veterans at safety help a lot with that. But there's no doubt this is going to be an adjustment for Randy Shannon. You got a new defensive coordinator. You got an entirely new set of characters coming in on the defense. This is going to be a learning process, and there's going to be some bumps in the road, and there's going to be a learning curve for these guys.
And that safety, we know Nick Washington, Marcel Harris pretty much wrapped up there. But is this a spring for Juwan Taylor to show that he fits in as well?
Absolutely. I think he's a guy that I would say is right now the number 5 guy in the secondary. Behind the 4 that we've talked about, Dawson, Gardner, Washington, and Harris. He's a guy that the staff is really high on. He's got great range. A 6'3" type guy who really can cover some ground. He's got a chance to be really, really good, and I think that you'll even see him rotate in some with the starters, I would expect, between Washington and Harris. Again, some of that depends on what happens at corner and how many young guys they're playing out there. There's no doubt that guy's got a very, very big upside at Florida, and the coaches are extremely high on him.
Thomas, who's somebody, looking at the roster, looking at the recruiting classes under McElwain in the last few years that you think it's time for them to make their move in the spring, and if they don't, they risk being recruited over?
That's a really good question. I think that I honestly think Kylan Johnson is potentially a guy that could be like that. I think that he's going to be battling Joseph, and I know that the linebacker position is kind of thin, but they've got some other guys at linebacker too. I really like Jeremiah Moon. I think he's a guy that can be one of those hybrid types that comes off the edge if you need him to, that we talked about. I think that Joseph versus Johnson is going to be one of the best battles of the spring. And if Kylan Johnson comes out on the losing side of that, he's still going to play, but he may not be quite the impact player that, a lot of people watching the spring game last year when he was all over the place thought he might turn into.
Yeah, maybe he slides back into a Daniel McMillan, big nickel type player or something like that if he doesn't win.
Yeah, and I think he'll have a bit better of a career probably than McMillan, but
Yeah, that wasn't throwing shade. I'm just saying.
Yeah. But I think he's a guy that this is his spring to potentially make a move, and if Florida does end up playing 3 linebackers, maybe he's a guy that ends up on the strong side. But Voshon Joseph is coming, and Kylan Johnson is going to need to be ready to play this spring.
And wasn't it last spring where Kylan Johnson kind of made his name in the spring game, right?
It was.
Yeah, I think he had 35 tackles or something.
Anything really at special teams, Pinero, Townsend, but I guess, return specialist, there's really nothing to look at there right now, is there?
That's hard to really get from spring ball.
Exactly.
I would expect, I don't know how much Dre Massey's going to do. I would assume not a whole lot this spring.
Yeah.
He's a guy that obviously figures prominently into kick return and probably even punt return too, given the way Antonio Callaway played last year. I think Freddie Swain, I think Chauncey Gardner, unfortunately Florida's probably doesn't have the depth that it needs to it in the secondary to risk him there, but I think he'd be a guy that'd be very good.
Hey, I've got a question for him. Okay, let's put on our tinfoil hats here for a minute. Because you talked about punt return. There's a guy that I identified as part of this 2017 class that I think could really help in the return teams, and that's Kadarius Toney. But I know that he is being recruited as a quarterback, and he's about the size of Trayon Harris, 5'10", 5'11", 180. And I want to see if I'm over-connecting the dots from your professional opinion. But I have heard the following lately. I've heard that he might actually get a look at quarterback. I've heard that McElwain might be a little bit enamored with incorporating some mobile quarterback aspects to his offense. I'm looking at some of the guys they're recruiting. Guys like Emory Jones, who's a dual threat Braxton Miller type, committed to Ohio State. Dorian Thompson-Robinson. You've heard things about Justin Fields, Joe Milton. Suddenly, we're not hearing so much about the Trevor Lawrences of the world, and we've got a lot of mobile quarterbacks on the board. Is McElwain thinking about mixing things up in his offensive philosophy to try to generate a spark?
Well, I have to say, nothing gets by you. I was actually going to say the same thing earlier. No, it does seem that Florida's kind of going that direction. That said, I'll believe it when I see it. McElwain is very much stuck to his system. The fact that they didn't try to even throw in some wrinkles against Alabama in the SEC championship game in 2015, when really you have nothing to lose. I get sticking to the system to help guys learn and build for the future. To me, that was a game where why not throw out the kitchen sink? Why not throw in a couple wrinkles? And maybe there are reasons there that we're not aware of, but I'll believe it.
Told him not to.
I'll believe it when I see it. I love Kadarius Toney as an athlete. I think he's got tremendous upside. I think he's one of the more elusive types that Florida really needs to get back to recruiting. But as far as the mobile quarterback aspect, believe it when I see it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to see Tony, probably 3 times a game line up in the backfield and just see what happens. But I'm like Thomas. From what we've seen from McElwain, I just don't. It just seems kind of hard-headed about that.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing them generate some offense however they have to do it. But it would be a little bit jarring if they were to make a change. And that's kind of something you saw in the Muschamp era as things were kind of floundering a little bit. And so I would rather them stick to the guns. I'm hoping that they can just work out this pro system and that everything ends up the way we want it to.
Yeah, I think, you said it. Will Muschamp tried to change his system late, and then, he had recruited for 3 years to a different system, and it gets very hairy if you start doing that. I don't think that Florida's to that point where if they did incorporate some, that it'd be a negative. I think it would very much be a positive, but typically you don't see coaches do that. And, even if they do, maybe that'd be great. It'd be great to see some innovation from this Florida offense. They certainly need it.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I ever saw Bobby Petrino changing his system and away for Lamar Jackson.
Good point.
That's just hopefully it works out that way if McElwain decides to branch off a little bit. So, guys, anything else before we wrap up here?
Thomas, you want to throw out a breakout player for spring, like somebody that you actually think is going to emerge to be a true leader on the field this year?
Yeah, let me first recap my breakout players from the last season. I had Jordan Cronkite, CJ Wharton, and DeAndre Goolsby. So
I withdraw my question.
Yeah, I'm basically shooting 100%, but like the wrong direction. Breakout player for spring. I would say defensively, I think Chauncey Gardner is going to be a star. I think that that may not even be a real breakout pick given how he played in the Outback Bowl. On offense, I really like LaMichael Pirine. I think that he's a little bit better as a pass protector, and I think people assume Jordan Scarlett's going to be the starter. If he can't get better at pass protection, I got news for you. That coaching staff recruited LaMichael Pirine very hard. They were very high on him, and he can catch the ball too. So there's a lot to like about him, and I think that he's got a real chance to push Jordan Scarlett for that starting job this spring.
Excellent. Well, now that you put the kiss of death on LaMichael Pirine.
Andrew Schneider's going to hate me.
Oh, no. All right. So that's it for this show. Thank you guys for listening. And remember to subscribe and share on iTunes and leave a review if you enjoy Gators Breakdown. Find us on SoundCloud, YouTube. Follow me, Dave, on Twitter at GatorDave_STC. Thomas, where can they find you on Twitter?
You can find me at my name, Thomas, and then Goldkamp. And Goldkamp is spelled with a K.
All right. Bill, anything before we get off here?
No, man, it's a pleasure. And Thomas, thanks so much for joining us, man. It was great to hear your insights on everything. And you can follow me on Twitter at RealBSykes.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It was a blast.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, Joey, our other co-host, he's taking a couple-week break. So, again, thanks to Thomas for joining us here. So, for Bill and Thomas, I'm Dave. Once again, thanks for listening to Gators Breakdown.